LiSTNR production.
A body is discovered in a fake check investigation. And arriving with lights and siren to lead the Washington Naval Yard active shooter incident in 2013. Tim Gallagher has more than 3 decades of broad investigative experience, including more than 20 years spent in senior leadership roles at the FBI. He was involved in some of the most high-profile investigations involving the FBI, and in particular, the Bureau's liaison with other investigative agencies. It was a multi-agency investigation that found someone had been murdered in a fake check scam across a number of states. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public, so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
I was working in a small FBI office. There were 6 agents based in Northeast Ohio. We were in the Cleveland division of the FBI. So working at a small office, everything we did hand in hand with our partners in both in private industry and with other law enforcement, whether that be state and local or other federal. I have an accounting background, so if whatever came through the door, if it involved a bank, it came to me. Whether it was a fraud, an internal fraud, external fraud, bank robbery, anything involving banks, I did. So I was part of the bankers working group where we would sit down, just like we're doing right now, have a cup of coffee once every 2 weeks, talk about trends, things that we're seeing. The bankers are talking about how they were seeing this flood of counterfeit checks that were coming into their banks. They looked like business checks, but they actually had personal routing numbers on them. So they were taking the money out of sometimes people's bank accounts, sometimes companies' bank accounts. So I got a local detective and a U.S. Secret Service agent myself, grabbed all this intelligence that we had gotten from the local bankers, and we just started putting this together. Shoe leather detective work, going out there, talking to the tellers who took the checks, going to the businesses that had lost money, and then one of the big breaks that we got was just one of the detectives who had been around for a long time. I mean, sometimes federal agents in the United States, they transfer us around, right? So sometimes we end up, we're new somewhere. So one of the police officers had been around for a long time. So, there are a couple of guys who were in our town doing this probably, 6-7 years ago, and they got put away by the feds down in the Carolinas. I think they may be out of prison. So we looked it up, and sure enough, they were out. And so we were thinking that these people could be back at it again. And then it was just every time someone passed a check that we were able to make an identification on, you go out, you make an arrest, whether that be local or federally, and just roll, see what kind of information you can get out. People in handcuffs love to tell stories, right? And so, we both, in law enforcement, so you just talking to people, find out what you can find out, just putting the pieces together. And, finally we got a break that this was an individual named Daniel Ideen, who was part of that group that had been arrested years prior, was one of the people who was involved. So we were able to get a fingerprint on a check that he had actually handled and given to somebody to cash, because they're all smart enough to not go into the banks, right? They give it to somebody else. And those are the people that you're picking out. But we were able to get his fingerprint, and we got a warrant for him, put it in the system. We had no idea where he was, but we put it in the system. And then sure enough, he got arrested in Virginia, several states away, because we had the warrant in the system. Local police in Virginia stopped him, and they said, "Hey, do you want him?" Like, of course, we have a warrant for him. So they flew him back, and we met him at the airport, sat him down, bought him a sandwich, a cup of coffee, and just started talking to him. And he said, he's like, "You guys came to my mother's house looking for me, and you were really nice to her." And so I'm like, well, why would I be nice to your mother? I mean, like, she didn't do anything wrong, And, you develop rapport, so he was cooperative just because we had been nice to his mother. And he told us, here's what's going on here. He said, we have a whole group of folks that, like, we rent computers and we make the counterfeit checks on the computers, and then we return them, because when you return the computers, they wipe the hard drives on them. This way, there'll be no evidence out there. We rent cars. We have a person who rents cars, and we have a person who works in a supermarket who steals check numbers. We rent people's checks on payday at factories as they come out on lunch. We say, here's $100. Give me your check, and they make a copy of it, and then they would create counterfeit checks, making thousands of dollars on this. Then they give the person back their check or whatever. And it was a pretty elaborate scheme. And he said, here's this one guy you need to talk to. He's just like me. He'll cooperate. And he said the guy's name's Gerald Sykes. And so, like, myself and Secret Service, we had all these surveillance pictures from all over. And we had a picture that was probably from, I don't know, it may have been down in Kentucky or Cincinnati, Ohio, where the checks have been passed. And he showed it to me. He's like, that's him. That's him in that picture. He's wearing a uniform from Goodyear. He said what we did was we rented someone's uniform, and then we cashed Goodyear checks that were counterfeit. We were going everywhere, and so sounds good. So we go and knock on Gerald's door. We're like, hey, Gerald, this is you. And he's like, you're right, it is. And like he gives the whole thing up too, right? And so he gives us names of people, and we're like, oh, we got it now. And then we'll tell Gerald, we're going to come back tomorrow, and we're going to put you in the car. I'm going to drive you around, and you're going to show us that we can rent the cars and everything. And so we go back the next day. He's not there. So a couple days go by. We still can't find him. So he figured he was going to get arrested himself. So he takes off. They all pointed to the ringleader as being a guy named Lonnie Thompson. That was the common denominator. So we were developing our case against Lonnie Thompson. And then I got a call from local detectives and said that they had arrested Lonnie Thompson and he wanted to talk to me. And I said, great. So myself and Secret Service went to talk to Lonnie, and Lonnie said, I want you guys to give me a pass, give me immunity, because I can solve a homicide. And I'm like, well, okay, well, we're willing to talk. We know who got killed. And he said, well, Gerald Sykes. And I'm thinking, okay, if anyone killed Gerald Sykes, it was probably you, right? Because Gerald was the guy who disappeared. He had been gone for a couple of weeks. No one knew where he was. And so sure enough, like Lonnie told us, he's like, I had nothing to do with it, but these guys killed him in a drug deal gone bad. And here's where he is. He's buried in a backyard. And I'm an evidence tech, so we got a search warrant. We went to the backyard. We dug the body up. And so here he was, he had been duct taped and he had killed. I didn't go into it, but there was another person who had ended up dead along the way in this case as well. And it turns out that person was killed by a family member who was also involved in this scheme. So, it was financial crime, but these are organized criminals, and they were willing to resort to violence. So I wish I could say that we prosecuted, Lottie for homicide, or we prosecuted anybody for homicide, but we couldn't. What we did was we put Lonnie in jail for a year for violating his supervised release from the check case in South Carolina while we tried to put the homicide case together, while we put together the rest of our check case. We couldn't do it, but we ended up putting him on trial for bank fraud, and he was convicted. And so went to trial. I testified in the court, and he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. We were hoping during those 9 years of prison that alliances, allegiances will change, right? And hopefully someone would give us the evidence that would be able to convict him or other people of this homicide of Gerald Sykes, but we weren't able to. This is not. If this were an FBI TV show, obviously he'd go to prison, people would start talking, and then we put together the murder case. We didn't, and I'm not pointing the finger at him as being the suspect. If there was enough evidence, we would have been able to charge him, right? So this individual died, was killed during the course of the case. Lonnie Thompson was very close to it, but we were able to put him away for 9 years. I'm sad to say that's the end of the case. That's where we're at with that now.
Tim, once Lonnie Thompson is away in prison, did that put an end to that series of counterfeit checks, or did it go underground and sort of pop up again, or was that the last that there was of that?
Well, in our area, it was done. That was it. I mean, that was like it. There was a spike, and it was because of him. And honestly, everything that came through the door we thought was could potentially be connected to him. So people were calling us for it. The state police were calling us, postal inspectors were calling us, everyone was calling us. And so we were able to really clean it up, and it really put a dent in it for a couple of years anyway.
On the face of it, you look at counterfeit checks going in and getting money from banks and other places. There's an element of it sort of sounding a bit like almost a victimless crime, for want of a better term. But here we see, as it filters down, 2 homicides linked to it and all the other associated crimes. Tim, just for our listeners, because you're investigating this as an agent of the FBI, how or why does the FBI get involved in this type of investigation as opposed to, say, state police?
There's a federal bank fraud statute that's on the books. It's for this purpose. When things aren't going interstate, sure, the police in Akron, Ohio, the police in Cleveland, Ohio, could have brought a case, a theft case, a forgery case against these individuals. But because it went into many different states and it involves a bank, there's a federal statute for that. And this fit nicely within that, that we could use that and then bring in all the behavior, checks are cashed in Michigan, Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, that sort of thing.
Because am I right, and I've been lucky enough to chat to some of your colleagues in the past, once crimes are committed and they start to cross state lines, that's also a trigger. Am I correct for the FBI to pick up the case and run with it, as opposed to state police in each state picking it up? Did I get that right?
That's correct. In most statutes, we'll have that interstate nexus that you have to prove that something went like that a fugitive went interstate, or that this fraud case, went interstate, or that sort of thing. But yep, right on the money.
Now, Tim, I picked up also that in one of those interviews, or one part of the investigation, you mentioned that you linked up with the Secret Service. I'm interested in just backtracking there. Where's that link, and how did the Secret Service get involved with the FBI in a counterfeit investigation?
The Secret Service has primary jurisdiction over counterfeiting in the United States. Obviously, they protect the president. That's their primary mission. But back, to the 1860s under President Lincoln, they were stood up to eradicate counterfeiting, and usually that counterfeiting is currency. But sometimes it's other negotiable instruments, and here it was checks. And so they have jurisdiction over it as well. So we have concurrent jurisdiction, and it was great because, as I said, I was in a 6-man office. The Secret Service agent was in a 3-person office. So we were able to leverage each other's agencies and work side by side for the better part of 2 years to bring this to trial.
In the age of most people getting paid, electronically, money's just sort of transferred from one account to another. Is this a crime that is still up and running or prevalent in the States, Tim, or is it a crime of a prior sort of investigative time frame?
It's funny you bring that up because I've spoken to bankers and they're still seeing it because of desktop publishing and computers have gotten so good, and counterfeiting holograms and everything. It's just it's not a checkbook now. That these are big checks, that would be counterfeit. Sometimes in a real estate closing or that sort of thing, where there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on one of these checks.
Coming up, leading a multi-agency emergency as an active shooter wreaks havoc at Washington Naval Yard. Tim, in September 2013, you led the investigation into the Washington Naval Yard active shooter incident. You oversaw the FBI's annex to the Pentagon's after action report. Can you walk us through this case and your involvement in it?
Sure. In 2013, I was a special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington Field Office Criminal Division. And in that role, I had about 250 agents who worked for me, in addition to a lot of police officers who were task force officers who were in FBI space working with us side by side. And we worked everything from drug trafficking to public corruption, street crime, crimes on a government reservation, any crime within the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, we were involved in. And because it's a federal city, we get involved in a lot of things that the FBI may not get involved in normally. And on this day in September, I was in my morning meeting, and a police detective from the Washington Metropolitan Police Department came into the room with his police radio in his hand, and he said, there's an active shooter, meaning there's someone who's walking through the Washington Navy Yard shooting and killing people. I jumped in my car, lights and sirens. It's about 4 miles away. You're just looking to get on site as quickly as possible, knowing full well that an active shooter situations, most of the time they're over, within about 5 or 10 minutes. The average active shooter in the United States, maybe 10 or 15 minutes long. This one, the shooter, Aaron Alexis, was on a rampage shooting for an hour and 9 minutes. So I got down there at about the 20-minute mark, and I met up with the chief of police for Washington, D.C., Kathy Lanier, and she was running the tactical response from the main gate of the Navy Yard. When I parked my car, I jumped out. A U.S. Marshal who was also responding ran by me, told me to put my vest on. He said, because this is still an active scene, they don't have the shooter or shooters, because at that point they didn't know that it was more than one shooter. So I actually put my vest on. I ran up. I was able to catch up to Chief Lanier, and she told me that her people were in one building. This Navy Yard had 20 buildings, 16,000 people working there. So her people were in one spot, and she said to me, like, I'm going to lead the FBI's response at this point. She's got the local police response, and I got the SWAT team deployed. The FBI SWAT team, came in on their trucks. And we sent them to a building where there was a report of another shooter. And so they went over there. We worked on it, clearing building by building. And then eventually, as I said, a little over an hour into it, after 13 people had gotten killed, the shooter was taken down in a violent gun battle where he shot 2 police officers. One was seriously injured. The other one took the round in his vest, and he was able to shoot and kill the assailant. I called in the FBI's hostage rescue team at one point by reaching out. The FBI's hostage rescue team is the most heavily trained, armed civilian police SWAT agency in the United States. They're based in Quantico, Virginia, which here, thankfully, was only 35 miles away. They came up on a helicopter, landed the helicopter right on a bridge, like a half a mile from the Navy Yard, brought bomb-sniffing dogs, and HRT operators and to lead the search to eliminate the fact that we may have had another shooter. It took a couple of hours, but we were able to clear it through videos, through interviewing people. And it's not unusual in an active shooter situation for people to say, hey, there's a second shooter here, because sometimes you imagine things because you're going through a traumatic situation. One situation was someone who was running holding a radio, and somebody saw something black in their hand, and they thought that potentially was a firearm. There were actually plainclothes police who were in an active shooter situation. You don't wait to put on your tactical garb. It's like get with a couple other officers and move down the hallway. And the videos of that active shooter, you'll see like a detective, dressed in plain clothes, a bike cop with his bike helmet on from the U.S. Park Police, and then a Metropolitan Police officer. NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents, So in summary, you had people, responders who were not wearing uniforms with identification with guns. And so, of course, that was what led to us having to eliminate that. People sheltering in place. So we worked on that as well, and being able to finally free them up. And then doing the crime scene, it was hundreds of thousands of square feet, the crime scene, which needed to be processed, shot trajectory. It was a homicide scene. As I said, there were 13 individuals that we had to process that scene and then start working backwards to see, was this individual connected to anyone else? Because is there another plot? Is there, that they're looking to execute somewhere else? So obviously we found out who he was, where he lived. We found out he had a roommate. And so, of course, we went back to his place, which is actually a long stay hotel, fully expecting to find his roommate had been killed by him, right? But the roommate was fine. We were happy to see that. But then executing the search warrant there, getting his computers, and then going through his electronics looking to see like what are his writings? Is there something else that's going on? Is he connected to somebody? But thankfully, we were able to work through that over the course of several days and determine that he did in fact act alone. And at that point, we worked with the U.S. Navy and the Pentagon to walk through how did this happen. This is an insider threat. This is not someone who walked in off the street. This is someone who was a contractor for the U.S. Navy, who went to work every day and then showed up one day and killed 13 of his colleagues. So we walked through how that was able to happen and make recommendations for tightening up the system going forward.
Tim, just to put this into perspective, this is the deadliest shooting in Washington, D.C. history at the time. It was the second deadliest on a U.S. military base. You're the chief of the Washington Bureau. You arrive at this scene. There's 1,000 things going on. I'm just really interested in, you mentioned hopping out of that car, local cops running past, telling you to put a vest on. You're sort of arriving at a scene, walking into the middle of it. It's an active shooting. Like you said, I think 20-odd buildings. It's a massive, massive scene. What's your role there? Are you starting to get fed information from both FBI and other agencies? Because you're running through a range of different policing agencies there. I think 3, 4, maybe 5. The FBI, they're at the top of the pile with regards to, I'd imagine, the chain of command, and you're at the top of that chain. What's that like in a situation like this, Tim?
Yeah, well, I tell you what, you have all that right. The one thing about this is that we have this saying in law enforcement: you never want to hand out business cards in a command post. You want to make your relationships on a sunny day, right? We all knew each other. And because in Washington, D.C., whether it's the State of the Union address, the presidential inauguration, a parade, a demonstration, we all work together on these things on a regular basis. So we all know each other on a first name basis, and we all know what assets everybody has and where their teams function the best. So like showing up there, I have a head start on that. I know who I'm speaking with. I've worked with these folks before in bad situations before. And I know that everyone's cool and focused on and executing the mission. And on here, we were actually working with maps on the hood of a police cruiser. And then everyone has their people next to them with radios so that we can relay information, because you're on different radio frequencies. We have a helicopter up in the air who's relaying things down. With the U.S. Park Police, we had the FBI radios. We were taking information in, and then, as I said, Metropolitan Police Department, Kathy Lanier, she had the tactical piece, right? She was the first one on the scene. I was, taking my lead from her. Like, where do we need to send our people? Your people are here already. Where can we help out? And then, of course, I had other federal agencies who they're in my phone. Like, I can't talk about how critical that is, that you have everyone's name in your phone, so that when you're in a crisis like this and your phone rings, their name comes up. It's not like some random number, like, I don't know who this is. The name comes up. It's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms reaching out. Hey, I got people here. And like, this is great. Can you come down here, park under this overpass? We may need you, right? We have 20 buildings. We may need another tactical building to go in. And it's like you fight like you train, right? And we've trained together so many times before. Sometimes it was a planned event. This is obviously a no-notice event, but it was bedlam because we didn't know that we were going to clear a safe situation at that point, and that, we could have been, taking fire ourselves at a certain point. And then, like, to top everything off, on top of all that, this is a U.S. Navy facility. The Navy's in charge. It's their facility, right? And their police officers all went into the building because they were looking to save lives. And so as far as connectivity to the U.S. Navy, for a little while, we didn't have it, right? Because everyone, including the chief, he went into the building, like, looking to get to that shooter and neutralize him. There was that going on as well, that, like, hey, you layer that on top of it. You have the United States Navy, this is their facility. But we were all able to eventually find each other. And then, like, once the U.S. Navy, like, their chain of command and their communications, it's like the best in the globe, right? And it was amazing the way we were able to unwind the situation with the assistance, not only my colleagues in law enforcement, but, layering in the United States Navy.
Tim, this is such an intriguing view because you're there, you're getting all this information. This is an incredibly high-pressure situation that went, as you mentioned earlier, this was an active shooting for an hour and 10 minutes. or thereabouts. Usually they're all done and dusted in 10 or 15 minutes. I've just got that mental picture of you in that sort of, you're on scene, but you're in that outer ring, I'd imagine, like on the bonnet of that car. You've got armed police in there from different organisations. You've got aerial support. I mean, this is, you mentioned earlier, this is like what we see on TV, but you're Johnny on the spot. And it's also interesting you mentioned that Washington is a federal city, so the FBI in Washington are more likely to be involved with active crimes as opposed to the retrospective investigation of crimes, which may be a more common role outside of DC. The parallel here, Canberra here in Australia, the capital, federal capital, has the federal police on the ground there who, as you say, have that active role of attending jobs as well as that investigation. This act of being there, chalk and cheese, totally different to the calm approach to retrospectively investigating a crime in hindsight, isn't it? You're there making decisions and the buck stops with you, Tim. It's an incredible insight.
Sure, yeah, it's a lot different than many types of FBI crimes. Number one, it's historic, right? You're looking back and trying to figure out what happened and then, bring the perpetrators to justice. Here you're hands-on, looking to stop a murderous spree before anyone else becomes a casualty.
The whole standoff from your arrival, you must have got there almost within minutes of it starting, the calls start coming through. So you're there on the ground for over an hour as this is actively happening, I think, prior to the shooter being taken out by local police. I just want to ask him, did that hour seem to last a day or did it seem to last 10 seconds? Like, what's it like being there in the moment?
In my mind, everything took place in like 15 minutes or so. And I'll give you a good example of that. Later on, it must have been into that night where we were making identifications of the folks who were deceased. Our crime scene folks were able to make a positive identification either through like what desk they were sitting on or through their ID, roll their fingerprints, and get into the system. And then we had victim specialists who were going out with the United States Navy and making the death notification. And so I was talking to them as they were going out, and one of the individuals was going out to make the death notification. A victim specialist was there from the FBI office in New Jersey. And I said, wow, you got here really quickly. And she said, Tim, that was 8 hours ago that the shooting stopped. And I'm like, wow. I was like, I didn't realize that, 8 hours had gone by. Obviously the Newark office is 3.5 hours away. But this was like 8 hours had elapsed. And I was like, wow, like that was quick. And, but you just don't know, right? And 8 hours in my mind was probably like 15 minutes.
Wow. The offender was shot and killed at the scene, Aaron Alexis. Any motive established following that, Tim?
Yeah. We went through his writings. We found a thumb drive, a flash drive, that had his reasoning for it. And he thought that, the U.S. government was sending radio waves into his brain. He was an emotionally disturbed person and he was going to get even with the U.S. government for doing that. And, that's what he did. And unfortunately, 13 hardworking civil servants, lost their lives that day.
With that in mind, and I'm just interested in the terminology that would be used around this and how it's defined. Would this act of shooting in Washington, would that be classified as an act of terrorism?
Well, we would have to tie it to a political motivation, violence, in furtherance of their ideology. And there was no ideology here. It was mentally disturbed. So we, in the FBI, we worked it as crime on a government reservation. That was the official case caption on it, that it was a federal installation and someone went in and killed somebody. On that thumb drive, if he had, alleged that, that he was trying to overthrow the United States government, that would make it an act of terrorism, or that he was doing this because he hated certain individuals. Because that's the first thing you do. Like from the FBI perspective, I'm like, is there any commonality among these victims here, right? Is this potential hate crime? But there isn't. It was just people that was targets of opportunity. But that's something else that you're looking at. Was it an act of terrorism? Was it a hate crime? Here it was, as I said, it was a crime on a government reservation, which was homicide.
And Tim, you had some involvement yourself, a fairly hands-on involvement in the annex that was presented to the Pentagon, the after-action report. Just in summary, what is that? And once that's been are presented. Who oversees that? And then I guess actions or suggested actions can be taken as a result of that. Is that how that works?
Sure. Yes, there was the Pentagon appointed an admiral from the U.S. Navy to take a look at this. How did someone who had a badge, who could badge their way to the building, to take up arms against those who worked with him? And hats off to the United States Navy. They just want to get to the truth here. Like what? And it was like, where had this individual been assigned? Well, he was an active duty sailor at one point. So let's go back through everything that he had done in his career, and were there indicators in the past, that he could have acted out? And there were psychological breaks. There was violence. There were things that should have been raised up and said, hey, this person does not belong in a government building, no less, in the United States Armed Services. So, that was what we dumped out and all together, and, we're able to categorize, and then the Navy, put their findings forward to how they need to change the clearance system, as well as how things are raised up when individuals are exhibiting behaviors that are troubling.
Tim, in your many varied roles within the FBI, at one point you ran the intelligence operation at the FBI's Washington field office during numerous high-profile events. And we can look at, for example, the 2009 presidential inauguration. That was Barack Obama. The State of the Union address, which would have been delivered by Barack Obama, 2010. 2010 also, you oversaw the intelligence operation pertaining to the annual meeting of the World Bank. Tim, we're viewing it from afar, but anybody who takes 5 minutes to look into the current or upcoming election, November the 5th in the US, is probably looking at it thinking, goodness, this is a very, very tense time for FBI and other organisations. It seems from our perspective that the ground has been laid for potentially an extremely volatile time in the US coming up to the November 5th election and the later inauguration in January. I'm really, really interested on your take on this and where things are sitting currently, Tim.
Sure. Yeah, I could take you back to, give you a background on how the FBI works these major events from my experiences that you just laid out there. Being on the intelligence side, I was responsible for running a command post where we're bringing in leads from many different agencies, probably 15 different federal agencies, police agencies as well, during the event. And during the 2009 inauguration, that was a 3 or 4 day event. It was not just, okay, the president gets sworn in and then he goes to the presidential ball and that's the end of it. It was several days worth of events where we have many high profile individuals moving around the nation's capital. Secret Service has overall responsibility for this event. It's a national security event, designated highest level. And so the thing about it is, like, the Secret Service is planning this for like over a year. So I'm going to meetings with the U.S. Secret Service. First, it was once a month for 2 hours. And then as you're getting closer, it's like every day that you're meeting. Plan for absolutely every contingency that is out there. And then, you have the intelligence nodes in place. So as information comes in, you could feed it out, whether it's to the local police, to the Secret Service, or, have obviously the protection responsibilities, or to our own people on the ground that, like, hey, we need to, there's like an individual who's in the crowd or approaching the city who may have harmful intent, and we need to do a field interrogation, work with the local police, make a stop, and question them. Looking at the perimeters, right? Like, and sweeping them in advance, because some of these groups are known to pre-position projectiles and things that they can use as weapons within the perimeter, right? If they know that, like, on such and such a date that this is going to be inside the perimeter, they can bury things, they can obscure things, and that's, something that, whether it was the World Bank or the inauguration, that we're definitely looking to mitigate. You talked about the situation now. Obviously I've been out of the federal government for 7 years now. I'm working with private security. What are we looking to protect them against, right? That's something that's key, that every time I have a client come forward and say, hey, I need protection. And it's like, well, what are we protecting you from, right? And that's like, well, you're going into cyberspace, right? I used to work where cyber meets fraud. This is where cyber meets violence, right? This is, this is the town square where the intelligence you're gathering, whether it be for the inauguration or for in 2024, or 2009, or now. I mean, you're out there looking to grab whatever you can out there. I'm in the private sector now, so like I don't have the same restrictive guidelines that you may have like within the federal government. But you're looking out there to see are people making claims, are people making violent threats? Is there chatter out there that needs to be mitigated against? Obviously, there are people out there who are saying things that cross the line, right? That are potentially criminal and show planning. There could be First Amendment protected activities, right? You can say whatever you want in the United States, pretty much, right? But there are certain things that you can't. And if it's going to be advocating violence, advocating in furtherance of an ideology, once you connect the two, the FBI will be looking into it and making a determination as to whether these individuals are dangerous and what mitigation steps can be taken.
It's a massive undertaking, and I could only imagine those in these roles are having a few sleepless nights as we move towards November. We look, history has a habit of repeating itself, and we all know what happened January 6th, 2021, insurrection at the Capitol building there, and that sort of almost caught America by surprise. I doubt that they'll be surprised again by anything such as that. And I just think of, the inauguration, whether it's Trump that gets in, whether it's Harris that gets in, you can have up to 1 million people there on the day. Is that correct? In the mall there in Washington. I mean, you can go so far, can't you? Many, many years ago, I worked diplomatic protection. I've looked after a big team of people, Queen Elizabeth coming and touring and things such as that. And the thing that always struck me about that is, even with all the good intent and everything else, at the end of the day, and I think you touched on it, that sort of lone wolf offender, that lone wolf operator that goes under the radar, that may not be part of a known organisation, very, very difficult to put plans in place to deal with that. I think, this follows on from an attempt, I think last month, an earlier attempt in October. So we're now 3 assassination attempts against Donald Trump. I think Obama, you'd know better than I, Tim, Obama had probably more assassination attempts and plans against him than any other president in US history. So this is just happening all the time over there.
Well, yeah, it's just like you said, it's that lone wolf that, is the biggest threat to law enforcement, because, you and I both work these types of cases, and what do? You look to identify them through their communications nodes, through who they're speaking with, who's radicalizing them, like what sites they're going to, and their funding, right? Are they part of a group, and are they being funded to take violent action, right? But like when you have a lone wolf, you don't have any of that. This could be someone who's radicalized, in their own basement. They're not talking to anyone else about it. That's obviously an area where in law enforcement, you tell people, if you see something, say something. And how many times does someone see something or hear somebody say something they're going to do, and they pick up the phone and call it, and then we can just start running the traps, right? But if they keep to themselves, it's very, very difficult for law enforcement to get them. And even if you're able to stop them, like, what are you going to charge them with, right? If they're acting suspiciously and they have a gun, well, it's legal in some places to have a gun. It's legal to display a gun, right? And it's a very difficult task to identify and take law enforcement action to neutralize.
Tim, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us here from DC. Thank you also for your service to the good people of the US in 20 years, 3 or 4 different locations, different bureaus for the FBI. Tim, thank you for your candor. Thank you for taking the time. It's just been such a pleasure to spend some time talking with you.
I really appreciate the invitation to come on your show. Thank you so much for your time today, and all the best.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a listener original podcast. The production team for this episode was Holly Mitchell, Jade Murray, and Link Kelly. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. I'm Brent Sanders. Thanks for listening. Just before you go, I want to let you know about an amazing new podcast the team here at LiSTNR has released. It's called Crime in Focus, Killer Charm. It's a fascinating story about a woman named Sharon Graham, or Muffin, who convinced a lover to kill her ex and another to aid in the cover-up by using a wood chipper. It's a tale of manipulation, greed, and control that asks how someone can be capable of this awful crime and if anyone saw the signs before things turned fatal. Crime in Focus, Killer Charm, is out now only on the LiSTNR app.